Every culture that has ever buried its dead has also, at some point, been afraid they might get back up. That fear is older than the word for it. It has worn different faces in different centuries. A corpse that will not stay in its grave in medieval Europe. A soul stolen out of a living body in the hills of Haiti. A shuffling neighbor in a movie theater in 1968. A fungus that turns an insect into a puppet and wears its body like a coat. The name changes. The shape underneath does not. This is an investigation into that shape. Not a checklist of movie monsters, but a search for where the fear actually came from. The real trials, the real diseases, the real graves that were dug up to check, the real scientists who went looking for a rational explanation and came back with something stranger than what they set out to disprove. Because here is the uncomfortable part. Almost every thread of the zombie myth, when you pull on it, leads back to something that actually happened. A man really was buried and really did come back. A fungus really does hijack a living body and drive it to its own death. A disease really can turn a calm human being into something that no longer looks like a person from the inside. We are going to move through this chronologically and geographically, starting with the word itself, moving through the belief system that gave it meaning, into the one documented case that made the rest of the world take that belief system seriously, out to the older folklore scattered across entirely unconnected civilizations, down into the real diseases and organisms that make none of this feel far-fetched, and finally into the single low-budget film that turned all of it into the flesh. Eating pop culture juggernaut most people picture today. Each chapter builds on the last. None of it requires you to believe in magic to find genuinely disturbing. The zombie, it turns out, was never really about the dead at all. It was always about what it would mean to lose the thing that makes you you, while your body kept walking around without you in it. Let's start where the word itself was born. Different cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, kept arriving at the same nightmare. This investigation keeps arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Almost nothing about the zombie had to be invented. Welcome to my channel. I'm Shadow, and if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to support us to give more. Thank you, and let's go. Most people who use the word zombie today picture the same thing. Gray skin, empty eyes, arms out, a slow shuffle toward warm flesh. That image is barely a century old. The word itself is much older, and for most of its life it had nothing to do with eating anyone. Linguists trace zombie back to West and Central African language roots carried across the Atlantic during the slave trade. Most plausibly to Kikongo and Kimbundu, terms referring to a spirit of the dead, a fetish, or a god, words like Nzambi and Zumbi. Enslaved Africans brought those beliefs to the Caribbean, where they fused with French Catholic imagery and indigenous Caribbean traditions to form Haitian Vodou. Somewhere in that fusion, the word narrowed. It stopped meaning a spirit in general and started meaning one very specific, very local nightmare. A person whose soul had been stolen while their body was forced to keep working. Been stolen while their body was forced to keep working. That is the original zombie, not a flesh-eating monster from a horror set, but a slave. A person robbed of will, obedience without consent, labor without a self attached to it. In a country with Haiti's history, built on the backs of people who were once literally owned, that image was not abstract entertainment. It was the worst thing a Haitian audience of the 18th and 19th centuries could imagine happening to them twice. Once in life, and again after death, when even dying was supposed to be the one guaranteed escape. That distinction matters, because it means the zombie myth was never really about monsters attacking us from outside. From its very first telling, it was about what could be done to us by someone else, a fear of losing control of your own body, while fully, horribly aware that it was happening. The word stayed almost entirely inside Haiti until 1929, when an American travel writer named William Seabrook published a non-fiction account of his time there called the Magic Island. Seabrook, by every account a strange and troubled man who would later be candid about his own struggles with alcoholism and his taste for shock value, described the zombie to an American readership for the first time as a soulless corpse dug from its grave and given a mechanical semblance of life. The description was sensational, not scholarly, and modern scholars of Haitian Vodou consider it a distorted, outsider's account. But it sold. 3 years later, in in 1932, Hollywood released White Zombie, the first feature-length zombie film, built directly on the appetite Seabrook's book had created. So before a single flesh-eating corpse ever appeared on screen, the word zombie had already made a very American journey. A real Haitian belief system, filtered through a sensationalist outsider, repackaged as horror entertainment for an audience that had never set foot in Haiti and had no interest in the theology underneath it. Everything that came later, the ethnobotanists, the film directors, the video game designers, was really just continuing that same process of borrowing the fear and leaving the original meaning behind. To understand how a zombie is supposedly made, you have to understand how Haitian Vodou describes a living person in the first place. Practitioners describe every human being as carrying two souls. The Gros Bon Ange is the larger, more universal life force, the animating spark shared by every living thing. The Ti Bon Ange is smaller and more personal. It is closer to what a Western audience would call personality, willpower, conscience, the part of you that makes decisions and remembers who you are. According to Vodou belief, it is possible for a sorcerer, called a Bakar, to separate these two souls and capture the Ti Bon Ange, leaving the body and the Gros Bon Ange animated but hollowed out, present, breathing, obedient, but with no one home to argue back. The body becomes a zombie, alive by every physical measure, dead in the one way that actually matters. In Haitian folk belief, zombification was not random. It was described as a punishment, often invoked against someone who had wronged their community, a thief, an abuser, someone who had broken a serious social code. Families in some rural communities were said to watch newly buried graves and even weigh down coffins, not out of grief alone, but out of a specific practical fear, that the person inside might be dug up before the body had a chance to decay and put back to work. This is the detail that separates Haitian zombie folklore from every zombie movie that came after it. Nobody in this tradition was afraid of being bitten. They were afraid of being harvested, kept biologically alive, stripped of the self, and used. It's a much quieter horror than a screaming crowd of the undead, and in some ways a much colder one, because it doesn't require anything supernatural at all to become horrifying. It only requires someone willing to do it, and a victim who never gets the chance to say no. This fear was taken seriously enough that it made its way into actual law. Article 246 of the Haitian Penal Code, dating in its original form to 1835 and expanded in 1864, classifies the use of any substance that produces a prolonged lethargic state without causing true death as attempted murder, and specifically states that if the victim is buried as a result of that state, the act is to be treated as murder outright, regardless of what happens afterward. In other words, Haiti has on the books a criminal statute that reads almost exactly like a legal definition of zombification. Whatever else is disputed about the phenomenon, the fear behind it was taken seriously enough to be written directly into a country's criminal code. For most of the world, this stayed a folk belief, a story, a warning, a metaphor for exploitation with no physical evidence attached. Then, in 1980, a man walked into a market in rural Haiti and introduced himself to his own sister. He had been dead and buried for 18 years. Clairvius Narcisse was born in 1922 in Lestier, Haiti. In the spring of 1962, he checked himself into the Albert Schweitzer Hospital with a fever, body aches, and a cough that brought up blood. His condition worsened fast, fluid in his lungs, dropping blood pressure, blue lips, numb and tingling limbs. 2 American-trained physicians examined him and pronounced him dead. His sister watched the sheet drawn over his face. He was buried the next day. In 1980, a man approached Narcisse's sister in a local marketplace, calling her by a childhood nickname only her brother would have known. He said he had been dug up from his grave shortly after burial, forced into a drugged, compliant state, and made to work as unpaid labor on a remote plantation alongside other zombies, until his captor died and the group scattered. He said he had waited to come home until he was certain his brother, the man he believed had paid for his zombification over a land dispute, was dead as well. The case reached Haitian psychiatrist Lamarck Douillon, who had spent years collecting zombie accounts and was determined to find one that could actually be verified. Narcisse's death and burial were documented on paper, witnessed by family, and confirmed by physicians. If this man really was Clairvius Narcisse, it was, for the first time, a zombification claim with a paper trail behind it instead of just a story. Narcisse was not the only case Daoyan uncovered. A woman named Francina Ilias, known locally as T-Femme, had reportedly died of a sudden illness in 1976 and was later found alive, having been recognized wandering with no memory of her own age, no sense of time passing, and almost no emotional effect. Her grave, when checked, was reportedly filled with rocks rather than a body. One detail from Narcisse's own account is the kind that stays with you longer than the rest. He described remaining dimly aware throughout his hospitalization and burial, hearing the doctors discuss his condition, feeling the sheet drawn across his face, and hearing his sister crying at his own funeral, all while completely unable to move, speak, or signal that he was still present inside his own body. Whatever ultimately explains the Narcisse case, that specific detail, a fully conscious mind trapped behind a motionless, unresponsive body while the people who love it grieve, is close to the purest possible version of the fear this entire myth is built on. Skeptics have pointed out the obvious problem with both cases. Mistaken identity, community pressure, and the psychological weight of a culture that already believes zombies exist could produce a convincing story without any potion at all. But Daoyan wanted a chemical explanation, not a psychological one, and he reached out to colleagues abroad for help finding it. That search led him to a young Harvard-trained ethnobotanist named Wade Davis, and to one of the strangest scientific investigations of the 20th century. In 1982, Wade Davis traveled to Haiti with a working theory. If zombies were real in any physical sense, the explanation would not be supernatural. It would be pharmacological. Somewhere, someone had to be using a substance capable of mimicking death closely enough to fool trained physicians, and another substance capable of keeping a person docile and suggestible for months or years afterward. Davis spent time earning the trust of Bachers, the same sorcerers folklore blamed for creating zombies, and eventually obtained samples of the so-called zombie powder used in the process. Laboratory analysis found the powders were not consistent from source to source, but several shared a dangerous common ingredient: tetrodotoxin, the same neurotoxin found in pufferfish, capable in the right dose of inducing paralysis, a dramatically slowed heartbeat, and a coma so convincing it can pass a real medical examination. Some samples also contain toxins from toads and traces of ground human bone, folded in less for pharmacology than for ritual weight. His theory, later published in the book The Serpent and the Rainbow, went further. He proposed that after a victim was buried and secretly exhumed, they would be kept compliant for the long term with regular doses of datura, a plant known in some regions as the zombie cucumber, capable of producing amnesia, delirium, and heavy suggestibility. Combine a death-simulating poison with a mind-fogging plant and a culture that already deeply believes zombies are real, Davis argued, and you don't need anything supernatural. Belief does the rest of the work. It is a genuinely elegant theory, and it made international headlines. It is also, decades later, still disputed. Other toxicologists who tested tetrodotoxin under controlled conditions questioned whether the doses described were reliable or safe enough to produce a predictable death-like state, rather than simply killing the victim outright. Some anthropologists argued that Davis had leaned too hard on a tidy chemical explanation for something that was, underneath, a deeply cultural and psychological phenomenon, a punishment carried out through belief and community consensus as much as through any powder. What almost nobody disputes is that Davis found something. Real Bachers, real powders, real neurotoxins, used with real, documented, terrible effect on real people who were failed by their own communities and their own families. Whether the full mechanism was chemistry, psychology, or some braid of both, the fear behind it was never invented. Somebody more than once really did lose their name, their memory, and years of their life to it. Davis's book was itself adapted into a 1988 horror film of the same name, directed by Wes Craven, which took the real research as a jumping-off point and then, as horror films tend to do, pushed the story into far more supernatural and violent territory than anything Davis had actually documented. It is a useful reminder of how this entire subject tends to work. A real, unsettling case gets investigated, a real, unsettling explanation gets proposed, And then the entertainment industry takes both and turns the volume up until the original research is barely recognizable underneath the finished product. It is tempting to treat Haiti as the single origin point of every walking corpse story, but fear of the dead not staying dead is close to universal, and it predates the transatlantic slave trade by a wide margin. Norse sagas describe the draugr, a corpse that remains conscious and physically strong inside its own grave mound, capable of walking out to attack livestock and travelers, and famously difficult to kill by any means that would work on a living person. Medieval English chronicles record supposedly reliable accounts of restless corpses, called revenants, blamed for plague outbreaks, livestock deaths, and nightmares, sometimes leading communities to exhume and mutilate a body to make sure it stayed down. During plague centuries in Europe, this fear became a matter of public health as much as superstition. Mass graves were opened in a hurry, sometimes before a victim had fully died, and bodies decomposing under pressure can shift, bloat, groan, and even appear to bite through their own burial shrouds as gases escape. Physical facts that, to a population with no germ theory and a fresh trauma of mass death, looked exactly like evidence that the dead were restless. Archaeological digs in parts of Europe have uncovered graves where skeletons were deliberately staked, weighted with stones, or decapitated after death specifically to prevent this kind of return. Ghoul folklore from Arabic literary tradition describes desert-dwelling creatures that inhabit graveyards and feed on the dead, later broadening in Western use to describe any corpse-eating monster. Vampire folklore across Eastern Europe overlaps heavily with early zombie fear as well, sharing the same core anxiety. A body that should be finished, that instead gets back up and comes looking for the living. The fear reaches back further still. One of the oldest surviving works of literature on Earth, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, includes a scene in which the goddess Ishtar threatens to break open the gates of the underworld and raise up the dead to outnumber and devour the living if she does not get her way. Arguably the earliest surviving zombie apocalypse threat ever put into writing, thousands of years before anyone had a word for it. Chinese folklore developed its own parallel tradition entirely independently, the jiangshi, a reanimated corpse said to move by hopping with arms outstretched, rigid with rigor mortis, driven by a stolen or corrupted life force rather than any decision of its own. None of these traditions borrowed from each other. They developed in isolated cultures, centuries and continents apart, with no contact between them. That independence is itself the most interesting piece of evidence in this entire chapter. When the same basic nightmare gets reinvented from scratch by unconnected civilizations again and again, it stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like something closer to a universal human fear, one that will apparently invent its own vocabulary if it has to. What all of these older traditions share with the Haitian zombie and the modern movie monster is the same underlying logic. Death is supposed to be a hard boundary. These stories exist specifically to ask what happens if it isn't. If the line everyone assumes is absolute turns out to be something a person, a curse, a disease, or a fungus can cross from either side. By the time the word zombie reached wider global attention in the 20th century, then it wasn't introducing a new fear. It was giving an old, nearly universal one a name that finally stuck. Part of why the zombie concept spreads so easily across cultures is that real diseases occasionally produce something close enough to it that no myth was required to imagine the rest. Rabies is the clearest case. Left untreated, it attacks the nervous system and can produce a furious phase marked by aggression, disorientation, excessive salivation, and a hallmark fear of water caused by painful throat spasms when swallowing. A rabid animal, and in rare advanced human cases a rabid person, can appear to lose the higher reasoning that normally suppresses aggression, becoming driven almost entirely by a lower, more reactive layer of the brain. Historians of the zombie genre have pointed to rabies repeatedly as a plausible biological seed for the idea of a bite that transmits a mindless, aggressive state from victim to victim. Prion diseases offer an even stranger real-world parallel. Conditions like kuru, historically documented among the Fore people of Papua New Guinea, and linked to ritual practices involving the deceased, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, cause a slow, irreversible degeneration of brain tissue, producing memory loss, loss of coordination, and a decline in personality and awareness long before the body itself fails. Prion are also notable for being almost uncannily durable, resistant to the kind of heat and chemical treatment that would destroy an ordinary virus or bacteria, a biological stubbornness that maps unsettlingly well onto fictional zombie contagions that refuse to die the normal way. In the early 20th century, a mysterious illness called encephalitis lethargica swept across the world in the wake of the 1918 influenza pandemic, leaving a portion of survivors in a profound, sometimes years-long state of physical stillness and reduced responsiveness, sometimes described at the time in language uncomfortably close to sleeping death. Some of those patients later experienced dramatic, temporary reawakenings decades afterward when treated with new medications, a case history that would eventually inspire its own body of medical literature about the line between consciousness and its absence. Fear of the reverse scenario, a mind trapped fully conscious inside a body that looks dead to everyone else, has its own long medical history. Premature burial was enough of a genuine public fear in 18th and 19th century Europe that inventors patented so-called safety coffins, fitted with bell pulls, breathing tubes, or flags that a mistakenly buried person could theoretically use to signal for help from underground. The fear was not entirely irrational for its era. Without modern methods for confirming death, cataleptic states and deep comas were occasionally mistaken for the real thing. Modern medicine has its own extreme version of this same nightmare in locked-in syndrome, a rare condition in which a person remains fully conscious and aware, but is almost completely unable to move or speak, trapped awake inside a body that no longer answers to them. None of these diseases produce an actual flesh-eating corpse, but each one independently demonstrates the same underlying nightmare the zombie myth is built on: a human body that keeps functioning, sometimes violently, after the person who used to be in charge of it is already gone, or a mind that keeps functioning long after the body has stopped responding to it. Fiction didn't have to invent that fear from nothing. Medicine had already been quietly documenting it for over a century. If you want to see something closer to an actual zombie process happening in nature right now, you don't need a laboratory or a graveyard. You need a rainforest, a carpenter ant, and patience. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, often nicknamed the zombie ant fungus, is one of roughly 320 related species in the genus Ophiocordyceps, of which several dozen confirmed species, and likely many more not yet described, are capable of manipulating their host's behavior. A spore lands on an ant, bores through its exoskeleton, and begins multiplying inside its body. For a time, the infected ant behaves completely normally, going about its usual work undetected by nestmates, even though its colony would typically expel any member showing signs of illness to protect the group. Then the fungus reaches the ant's brain, and the behavior changes. Researchers studying the process describe infected ants abandoning their normal foraging paths, wandering erratically, and suffering repeated convulsions that knock them out of the tree canopy entirely, a stage some scientists call summit disease, because the ant is compelled to climb to a very specific height and clamp its jaws onto a leaf vein with a grip so strong it often outlasts the ant's own death. The fungus then digests the ant from the inside, and days later sends a fruiting stalk up through the back of its head to release spores onto the forest floor below, continuing the cycle. This particular fungus reached a global audience years before The Last of Us existed. It is worth being precise about what this is not. Mycologists are clear that no known cordyceps species can survive at human body temperature, and there is no credible pathway from an ant brain fungus to a human pandemic. The version of this idea popularized by the show and video game The Last of Us is fiction layered on top of a real organism, not a documented threat, though some researchers note that rising global temperatures are gradually giving a small number of unrelated fungal pathogens more opportunity to adapt to warmer hosts, including humans, a slow-moving, genuinely worth-watching public health story that has nothing to do with mind control. But strip away the human infection angle, and what's left is still one of the most unsettling things biology has ever produced without any help from folklore. A living thing that can override another living thing's nervous system, so completely that the victim will walk to its own death on command and never once fight back. Every zombie movie ever made is, in that narrow sense, just late to a story nature already finished writing. Everything up to this point in the story, the Haitian zombie, the European revenant, the diseases, the fungus, describes a victim, someone or something done to. The flesh-eating, brain-craving zombie horde that dominates modern pop culture is a much newer invention, and it has a single specific birthday, October 1968, and a single specific author, a young Pittsburgh filmmaker named George A. Romero. Night of the Living Dead was made on a budget of roughly $114,000, shot in stark black and white, and centered on a group of strangers trapped in a farmhouse while the recently dead, reanimated by causes the film only vaguely gestures at, surround them outside. Romero and co-writer John Russo never actually used the word zombie in the film itself. What they invented instead was the modern behavioral template nearly every zombie story since has borrowed. Slow, shambling, driven by hunger rather than intention, defeated only by destroying the brain, and capable of turning a victim into one of their own through a bite. This was a sharp break from the Haitian tradition the word zombie came from. Romero's creatures weren't slaves with stolen souls, obedient to a master. They were a mindless, spreading condition, closer to an infectious disease given a body, and that shift is exactly what let the genre travel so far beyond its origins. A zombie apocalypse doesn't need Vodou cosmology to make sense to an audience. It only needs a bite, a countdown, and the horrifying math of exponential spread. Romero shot the film with a cast largely made up of friends and local collaborators, and cast Dwayne Jones, an African-American actor, in the lead role, a choice Romero later described as driven by Jones simply being the best actor available to them. Made in a film that arrived in theaters the same year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Audiences and critics have spent the decades since reading the film's violence, its bleak ending, and its imagery of ordinary Americans turning on each other as commentary on the era's racial tension, the Vietnam War, and a growing distrust of institutions. Readings Romero mostly welcomed after the fact, even if survival horror on a shoestring budget was the more immediate goal on set. The film went on to gross tens of millions of dollars internationally from that tiny original budget, spawned sequels, remakes, and an entire industry of imitators. And because Romero's team failed to properly secure copyright on the original release, it fell into the public domain, meaning, in a strange bit of poetic justice, that Romero's zombies became free to spread to absolutely anyone who wanted to use them. 50-some years later, they still are. Everything downstream of 1968 is essentially a set of variations on Romero's template, each one adjusting a single dial. Later entries in Romero's own series pushed the social commentary further, using shopping mall settings and survivalist bunkers to satirize consumerism and militarism. A wave of 21st century films and television introduced the fast zombie, sprinting rather than shambling, driven by a rage-like infection closer to a weaponized version of rabies than to the original supernatural curse. Long-running television adaptations shifted the focus again, treating the outbreak less as the story itself and more as a backdrop for examining what survivors are willing to do to each other once law and order disappear. Video games took the template in yet another direction, turning the zombie horde into a resource management problem, a countdown clock, and a genre-defining reason to fortify a location and ration ammunition. Every one of these is still, underneath the production budget, running on the exact same 9-word premise Romero shot in a farmhouse for a little over $100,000. Strip away the setting, the Haitian plantation, the Norse burial mound, the plague pit, the Pennsylvania farmhouse, and every version of this myth is answering the same question. What would it be like to lose the thing that makes you a person, while your body kept going without it? That is a different fear from ordinary death, and arguably a worse one. Death, for most belief systems, comes with an ending. The zombie doesn't get an ending. It gets a continuation with nobody driving. Psychologists who study horror as a genre point to exactly this as the mechanism behind the zombie's staying power. It isn't really about violence. It's about identity, autonomy, and the terror of becoming an object instead of a self. Losing your name, your memory, your ability to say no, while still technically being alive enough that everyone around you has to deal with what's left. That fear also happens to be remarkably portable across history's actual traumas. It mapped onto slavery in 18th century Haiti. It mapped onto plague and mass burial in medieval Europe. It mapped onto Cold War anxieties about brainwashing and conformity in mid-century American cinema. More recently, zombie fiction has surged in popularity alongside very real modern fears: pandemics, biotechnology, the slow erosion of individual attention, and in an oversaturated information age. Every generation, it turns out, has its own version of the thing it's most afraid of losing control to, and the zombie is simply a shape roomy enough to hold whatever that happens to be at the time. It also helps that, unlike almost every other classic monster, the zombie doesn't require you to believe in magic to be afraid of it. A vampire needs the supernatural. A werewolf needs a curse. A zombie only needs a virus, a fungus, a toxin, or in Hades' case, a belief system and a willing backer. Mechanisms close enough to real science and real history that the fear never has to ask for permission to feel plausible. Philosophers even independently arrived at their own bloodless version of the same idea. In debates about consciousness, thinkers use the concept of a philosophical zombie, a hypothetical being that behaves exactly like a normal human, speaks, reacts, and functions identically in every observable way, but that has no actual inner experience behind any of it, nobody home, no felt awareness driving the performance. That thought experiment exists purely to interrogate what consciousness even is. That it landed on the exact same image, a body doing everything a person does with nothing genuinely present behind the eyes, as folklore, medicine, and horror cinema all did independently, says something about how deep this particular fear actually runs. It is probably not a coincidence that zombie fiction has surged in popularity during periods of collective anxiety about exactly these questions on a larger scale: pandemics, biotechnology, surveillance, and the sense of losing individual agency inside systems too large to see the edges of. Every generation seems to reach for this myth precisely when it needs a way to talk about a fear it doesn't yet have a better name for. That is, in the end, the real reason this myth has survived in every century and every culture it has touched. It was never really fiction pretending to be real. It was always real fear, wearing just enough fiction to be survivable to think about. And that was it for today. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any suggestions, let me know. Like and subscribe for support. Hope to see you later.